Um, as you also are aware, in the last few months, after the election of Trump as president of the United States, a theme that has emerged from his many um, speeches and interviews is represent a real threat to Canadian sovereignty and independence. And as Science for Peace, we became very concerned about this issue, as most of our Canadians have been concerned, and that has been reflected in the results of the last election. And we thought that it would be appropriate to discuss an issue that perhaps it hasn't been dealt in the last events that we have had, which is the issue of nonviolent. Already indicated we are going to have two talks. The first one is going to be by Jamila Raqib, and she's going to talk about something that she has investigated for many years, which is the nonviolent resolution of conflict. Jamila is a specialist in the study and practice of strategic nonviolent action. She is the executive director of the Albert Einstein Institute, which is a nonpartisan organization that works to advance the research and application of nonviolent action worldwide. For more than 15 years, Jamila has worked closely with the late Dr. Jean Sharp, the foremost scholar of the field of strategic nonviolent action. As a director's fellow at the MIT Media Lab, Jamila conducted research on how to improve systems for nonviolent action research and education. She's currently working on the development of a learning platform to help groups prepare strategic plans to conduct struggles for the defense and attainment of their civil and political rights. Jamila, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jorge, and thank you to you all for being here. And thanks, Richard, for inviting me to share some thoughts today on civilian-based defense, a concept that holds such great relevance for our world. I'd like to use this time together to introduce the topic and to also explore how such a policy and type of action can enable a society to deter and defend itself from attacks against its people and political systems. I realize that perhaps the majority of our audience is Canadian. I'm not Canadian, and as an outsider, I don't know Canada well. I don't know Canada's internal society or its political situation. So my comments today will be generic, and I'll leave any consideration of the precise relevance and application of this policy to my Canadian colleagues. My goal today, and the goal of the Albert Einstein Institute more generally, is to promote greater understanding of nonviolent means of struggle, of which civilian-based defense is one application. Because we think this information is important for all societies, and also in the hopes that it can encourage people to assess the relevance of this type of action to their own situations, and therefore more globally reduce the reliance on violence as an instrument of policy. My introduction and my concern of how a society can defend itself from attack came very early, long before I started working with Gene Sharp, the scholar who spent his whole life studying it. But maybe I didn't formulate it as such, and I didn't know there was a term for it. I've been thinking about this question for a long time because I'm from Afghanistan, maybe one of the most invaded countries on the planet. I was born during the Soviet invasion and occupation of the country, and my family became refugees in the United States, where I'm now based. As you can imagine, the brutality of the war and my experience fleeing the country was traumatic. Mostly it manifested itself, especially in my early childhood and the early part of my life, as a sort of profound sense of helplessness, powerlessness, vulnerability. but also later a determination that our societies should have an effective way to protect themselves. My work now at the Albert Einstein Institute stems from this central idea that even if we acknowledge the destructiveness of war and violence, it's not enough just to denounce it, because people still need a way to defend themselves, and societies need an effective means of defending their populations and their political systems from attack, whether those attacks are carried out by external aggressors or internal ones. So defense is a basic need for every community and society and country. But we need to be clear about what we mean by defense, because the word isn't always used carefully. Defense isn't retaliation or destruction of the opponent, the entity carrying out the attack. The term actually needs to be understood literally. It's the protection of people's lives, the protection and preservation of a country's independence and its institutions, and very importantly, the preservation of its freedoms and its standards of legitimacy. And by that, we mean its values and its principles and its norms. Well, in most of our societies, as we know, defense is usually understood as military capacity, even though military means are themselves not capable of actually defending a society. For one, the limitations of military means are because sometimes access to these means aren't available, or because they're too weak to defeat an attack. The opponents are sometimes more powerful militarily, and any armed struggle would likely lead to defeat. It could also be because military means are too strong, and using them can only bring mutual destruction. And preparing for my time with you today, I read or reread some of Gene Sharp's work, who was, as I said, my colleague and mentor and the founder of the Albert Einstein Institute. He says it's ironic that in our attempts to develop better means of defending ourselves, we've actually just ended up building and using more destructive military technology. The same technology that has made defense less and less possible as an actual tool. Why? Because its destructive power is too great. What we actually need is a way to neutralize and end attacks against our societies that don't also destroy our societies, the very ones we're trying to defend. Fortunately, there's another means of, available to defend ourselves. And it depends not on the newest weapon system, but the oldest. And that's the power of an organized and defiant population. And that's the perspective I'd like to offer, how nonviolent struggle can be refined and applied with greater advanced planning and preparation in order to achieve the challenge of national defense. Even though this history isn't well known across a variety of countries and cultures, non-military and non-violent means of struggle have been used against threats faced by societies. These struggles were often improvised and spontaneous and carried out by a defiant and courageous population, usually with no strategic or tactical planning or advanced preparation. In spite of this lack of advanced planning and preparation, in a number of cases, they achieved important successes. So that's the focus of the work of the Albert Einstein Institute, to study historical and contemporary accounts of how people have defeated authoritarianism and dictatorship and invasions and other serious systems of oppression. The idea is that there's a lot we can learn from these cases about what made them succeed and fail, and that this information offers lessons and insights into addressing the problems we face in our world today. Before I touch upon this methodology, I'd like to describe one such case, which is perhaps one of the most important examples of how nonviolent action was used for the purpose of national defense. And that's the struggle in Czechoslovakia against the Soviet and Warsaw Pact invasion and occupation of 1968 and 1969. So in the 1960s, Czechoslovakia experienced a period of liberalization and reform, which led to the period known as the Prague Spring in 1968. This made the Soviets nervous, and on the morning of August 21st, 1968, they, along with a number of Warsaw Pact countries, invaded Czechoslovakia. So within a week, over 500,000 troops filled the streets of Prague. And in Prague alone, 500 tanks were stationed at strategic locations. The Soviets expected that the operation would be quick, They estimated that it would take 4 days to overwhelm the Czechoslovakian army, crush any military resistance, and install a puppet government. But they were completely unprepared for the kind of resistance that they were about to face. And at first, they were right. There wasn't a lot of military resistance. Czech soldiers were ordered to stay in their barracks, and there was some limited violence from regular citizens, mostly young people who set tanks on fire and threw Molotov cocktails at the troops. But even this limited violence was denounced by the Czechoslovakian leadership. And instead, they began circulating calls for the so-called passive resistance. They used underground radio, TV, and newspapers to instruct the population on what to do. First, citizens were to communicate in any way they could that they rejected the invasion. And second, they were to refuse to cooperate with it in any way. The goal of the resistance was clear, and that was to prevent the Soviets from taking control of the country. So the resistance was widespread, and it took on many forms. In the early days of the invasion, people were informed by the underground radio broadcasts that there were likely going to be arrests that night. So the broadcast instructed citizens to slow down the movement of troops by painting over street signs and house numbers until the wanted people had time to escape. They also used slogans and graffiti. They published leaflets, pamphlets, newspapers, and of course, as I mentioned, the underground television and radio broadcasts. Around the country, people rang church bells, they blew their horns, they sounded sirens to protest the invasion. And the sounds were so disconcerting to the occupation soldiers because they had been told that they'd be welcomed with open arms, but instead they were booed and taunted and spit at even. In one small village, citizens formed a human chain across a bridge and blockaded a Russian convoy of tanks and other vehicles. After 8.5 hours of the blockade, the Russians were forced to turn back. Writers, intellectuals, and artists played key roles, and they used art and culture and music to maintain morale and to promote their national identity. International solidarity protests to the occupation took place in a number of countries, in Italy and Austria and France and Holland. But mostly people inside the country, ordinary people, refused to comply or provide any assistance or obedience to the invaders, including by denying them food, water, and lodging. And this was hugely problematic because the troops were, as I said, expecting a warm welcome, so they didn't bring very much in the way of food or supplies with them. In one case, in the town of Bratislava, the troops had occupied an old castle that was also a museum, and the curator in charge just turned off the water. So finding drinkable water became a real problem. And for several days, water had to be brought in from Hungary by helicopter. You can imagine how costly that was financially, but also in terms of morale. In Prague, people told the soldiers that the water supply had been poisoned. So the soldiers were forced to drink water from the Danube, which was heavily polluted. So then they became sick. And all of this just added to their distress and their demoralization. So underground television stations were set up all over Prague, along with radio stations because they were easier to set up and hide. And the broadcast created a sense of solidarity and hopefulness among the citizens, and really kept them informed about what was happening around the country. The media was also, and I think this is a really important insight, the leadership used the media to direct people on the types of actions to take. And that included not just leadership, but also people that were well known and respected. So celebrities and athletes and newscasters and other intellectuals, they all urged nonviolent resistance and non-cooperation. So the Russians realized that leadership was using the media to coordinate resistance, so they tried to stop it. So equipment was brought in to jam the signals of the broadcasts, but the train carrying the equipment never made it to Prague. First because like the electricity mysteriously failed, and then afterwards it was stuck between two broken down trains. They had to eventually transport the gear by helicopter. So I'm focusing so much on Czechoslovakia because I think it's such an important case. And just to add to what was happening among the leadership, the Soviet plan to install a puppet government also didn't go smoothly because the Czech officials that could have served in such a role, they felt so much social and political pressure to not be perceived as collaborating with the Soviets, that there was no one with any legitimacy that could be enlisted to form a puppet government. Meanwhile, Czech officials and government bodies continued to meet in secret locations, all while, actively calling for the population to resist. So the resistance went on for 7 days, essentially making the country ungovernable and denying the Soviets their objectives. And it's precisely because the resistance was nonviolent that it created such severe logistical and morale problems for the invaders. They were just completely unprepared for it. The struggle ultimately failed, or some might say it failed, not because the nonviolent resistance was defeated, but because Czechoslovak officials gave in and compromised with the Soviets and agreed to an agreement that got rid of many of the reforms of the Prague Spring. And this agreement left the population demoralized, so resistance kind of went down, but it continued at a smaller scale, and it was ultimately successful in holding off full Soviet control for 8 months, which was pretty much unthinkable. And at that point, the reform leadership was removed and a conservative government favored by Russia took power. And this really is a testament to the power of nonviolent civil resistance and also the limitations of military means. Because where military means would have likely failed, the improvised nonviolent struggle kept the Soviets from installing their puppet government. And this is an important point. What was achieved was done so in spite of the fact that the resistance was improvised. So when we consider the success of this case or any other past case, let's do that in this context. The population, its institutions, the legitimate government, they had almost no preparation, organization, training, special equipment, or any planning in nonviolent resistance. And just as a quick aside, they're already not very successful, but imagine how much less successful wars would be if there were no, organized armies, no advanced training of soldiers, no research or development or accumulation of weapons, no studies of military strategy, no organized transportation and communication, and on and on. And in the Czechoslovakian case, imagine what could have been possible, how much more effective the resistance could have been if it was part of a wider strategy rather than a series of spontaneous improvised actions. Imagine if there was advanced planning that could have enabled the leadership to coordinate the resistance and training, that could have enabled them to enable people to be more strategic and more disciplined and ultimately more powerful. So this is the idea on which the concept of civilian-based defense rests, as one application of the general technique of nonviolent action to the problem of national defense. Let's say it's a more developed and refined application. The idea is that governments and civil society groups can put in place a component of their defense strategy, their defense policies that utilizes the power of its citizenry, as distinct from its military, to nonviolently defy invaders and to refuse to cooperate with them. And that such a policy can deter aggression against that society and also defeat it if it's attempted. The goal of this resistance, as it was in the Czechoslovakian case, is to deny attackers their objectives and to make it impossible for them to control the society and to consolidate their political power. It would also be designed to undermine the morale and loyalty of the attackers' troops and their administrators, and to promote unreliability in carrying out orders and repression, and cause them to defect or even potentially to mutiny. And obviously, all of this is meant to be achieved not through violent weaponry, but by using social, economic, political, and psychological methods. So Gene Sharp has identified nearly 200 of these specific methods in his so-called 198 methods of nonviolent action, which documents the types of actions that people have historically taken. The list is one of our most popular resources, so you might have come across it, and we can include a link to it. The list was first published in 1973, but it's grown a lot as people have invented new methods and used old methods in new ways, fueled by social media and technology and basic human innovation and creativity and imagination. and our colleague Michael Beer, who I see is with us today, has a book called Civil Resistance Tactics in the 21st Century, which innovates on the 198 methods and documents actually 346 methods of nonviolent resistance. So the original 198 methods of nonviolent action categorizes methods based on what they do and how they work. The first category is the methods of protest and persuasion, and these are used to communicate something that people either agree or disagree with a particular law or policy or political leader or a system. These are the methods that we're seeing a lot in our world today. You know, the marches, the demonstrations and vigils, the public speeches, the petitions and the banners and blogs and things like that. The second category, the methods of non-cooperation. These are designed to slow down or stop cooperation, assistance, or obedience to a particular policy or system. And this category is more powerful than the methods of protest and persuasion, and they include methods like labor strikes, economic boycotts, and withdrawal from education institutions or military defections or mutiny. The third category are the most powerful of all, and these are the methods of nonviolent intervention. And they're powerful because they create alternative power. They're the creation of new institutions, new media, new councils, and systems for leadership. So studying this sort of toolbox of things that you can do, this whole kind of repertoire of actions you can take is eye-opening, and it's empowering for people. But the power of these actions comes from figuring out how to use them as part of a strategy to cut off the supply of power to an opponent and to strengthen and build alternative power for the society. And that requires advanced planning and preparation by a society. You know, Dr. King said that unfortunately there's no neat row of buttons that we can push to get the outcomes that we want. But the knowledge of how to prepare, to plan, to train in a society exists, and it's growing. It's based on considerations of the political systems of our opponents and those who might attempt to undermine our society and political systems, their strengths and weaknesses, their capacity for repression, as well as information about our own societies, our strengths and weaknesses, our communication and information capacities, our numbers, the degree to which we understand nonviolent resistance, the degree to which we have training, and how we can develop that capacity to maintain resistance in face of repression. And ultimately, this planning, even if it's not needed in the context of an immediate crisis, it's important for all of our societies as a sort of civil resistance muscle that can be activated to build more democratic societies capable of deterring violations against us and facing problems of all kinds. And that's what a civilian-based defense policy is designed to do, to empower a population to be responsible citizens who can play a role in their own defense. Because historians of authoritarianism and democratic breakdowns are clear about this. These breakdowns in our democratic institutions and other violations against us, they succeed not because people support them, but because people fail to act or they take too long to act. And that happens because of confusion and fear, which are really the best tools in the attacker's playbook. Because the goal really is to keep people disoriented and overwhelmed, to promote helplessness, and to give a perception that our attackers are all powerful and that any resistance against them is futile. The best antidote to this is planning and preparation and capacity building. And I look forward to hearing about how this important work can be carried out in all of our societies. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing Richard's thoughts on that question and also to hearing from all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jamila. It was really very interesting. Before introducing the second speaker, I just want to pass an advertisement. On May 14th at 7:30 p.m. At the Friends House, we are going to have this second part of this series that we entitle Safeguarding Canada's Sovereignty. In this case, the speaker will be Dr. Michael Byers. Michael is a Canada Research Chair, a professor at the University of British Columbia, and is an international expert in international law and conflict and global politics. So I invite everybody to register to this talk, which is going to be in a hybrid mode. So people could attend, but also if they are not able to attend personally, they can register to listen to the presentation by Zoom. Okay, so now I'll be introducing our second speaker, who is ours, Richard Sandbrook, the Vice President of Science for Peace. Richard is a Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Toronto. He also chairs our Nonviolent Action Working Group at Science for Peace. And we are really excited to have him talk about an area that he has been doing research very actively in the last couple of years. Richard, the floor is yours.
Well, I mean, Jamila's presentation was just so good that I'm not sure I should say anything now, that we should go probably directly to questions from that. However, I, of course, will continue to say something, and in particular to try and apply the general principles that Jamila has referred to, and also the principles and the case of Czechoslovakia to the case of Canada today. And my argument is that nonviolent civil defense is the most effective way of deterring and defending against an invasion of Canada at the least cost. And by least cost, I'm referring to the casualties and damage to infrastructure and buildings. I should say right away that when I'm talking about the importance of civilian defense in Canada, I'm talking about the southern part of the country. The Arctic frontier cannot really be defended by civilian defense for the reason that there are very few civilians in the north. Civilians there do play a very important role in monitoring what's going on, but in effect, one would need a military response in the north. And one hopes that the Canadian government, in its expenditures on the military equipment in the next few years, will focus very much on preparing Canada to defend the Arctic frontier. Well, it is natural for people to be skeptical of the proposition that I have put forward, that nonviolent civilian defense, that unarmed civilians can actually deter and defeat a well-armed military incursion into Canada. I mean, it is counterintuitive that this should work. And it is a case that defense, as Jamila had pointed out, is generally thought of as military defense, soldiers, allies, weapons, and that sort of thing. However, what I'm suggesting is that our biggest asset is actually our people in Canada and their willingness to learn and the techniques of nonviolent action and to use those in countering any potential attack on Canada. Because really, nonviolent civilian defense is ideal for those small countries on the periphery of superpowers, because obviously the smaller country cannot prevail militarily if it comes to any kind of military exchange. There would be, if we used our military, there would be enormous damage to a lot of casualties and a lot of damage to our infrastructure and buildings. And a couple of opinion writers for the Globe and Mail have suggested that we Canada gain access to nuclear weapons and use this as a deterrent against attack from the U.S. I think that's a terrible kind of option from many points of view. I'm sure you all, I don't need to tell this audience why, but at the very least, Canada would be then breaking its commitments under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement, and as well would be highly provocative, or probably bring about the kind of invasion that we are trying to prevent. One of my colleagues at the University of Toronto, Dr. Aisha Ahmed, has suggested that an invasion of Canada by the United States would lead to an insurgency, which would be so prolonged and violent that it would lead to actually to the collapse of both countries after several years. So in general, the military options are very, very uncertain, and therefore what I'm suggesting is that our best approach, if it ever should come to the fact that the US invades, which of course is unlikely, I'm quite agreeable that it's unlikely, but that we need to, in fact, prepare for the worst, that if there should be an incursion in southern Canada, that the government order the troops into the barracks in the same way as the Czech government did in 1968, ordering the troops to remain out of action, and then using nonviolent civilian defense as the major means of dealing with the incursion. So this raises the issue of what is the secret of nonviolent civilian defense? How does it work? How does it succeed? And I think that Jamila has already mentioned some of this, so I'll go through it quite quickly. It seems there are four aspects to this issue. The first one is that the civilian defenders deny consent to the invaders. And just to say that rule Canada, if there is complete non-cooperation with the invaders, it doesn't matter how many tanks there are or how many troops there are, if there is complete non-cooperation, lack of information, complete bureaucratic shutdown, then it's impossible actually to rule. This ends up by actually paralyzing the military force. And secondly, the second aspect of civilian response is to undermine the pillars of support for the invader. And the pillars of support in this case would, of course, be the soldiers and their administrators who are part of the expeditionary force. And here, as Jamila talked about in the case of Czechoslovakia, what is needed is undermining further the morale of troops who are, in any case, probably having low morale. Because after all, if you think of an armed force, it is made up of individuals. Those individuals have their own goals, their own concerns, their own values. Many of those individuals would regard Canada very favorably. They would maybe have family in Canada or friends or are trained with Canadian troops, and they would already have low morale. Through fraternization with American troops, it may well be possible to lower that morale further and hopefully lead to situations where troops refuse to obey orders if they are called upon to violently suppress the demonstrators. The second pillar of the invasion, of course, is the American people. The American people, and the American people are not our enemy. In the event of an invasion, the majority of the American people would actually be on the side of Canada, and they would be absolutely very angry and very ashamed of the United States invading its closest ally for the last 150 years. And what happens in Canada would be transmitted back to the US via television and social media. So to be very clear what is going on in that situation, and one could expect a great deal of protest developing throughout the US in this context. The third aspect of civilian defense is marshaling worldwide opinion against the United States, to really designate the United States as a pariah state, and through the denunciations of various governments and groups throughout the world. Now, one objection to what I've said that many of you may feel is, well, why wouldn't the expeditionary force simply violently repress the civilian defenders? They're unarmed. They're not any danger to the lives of the soldiers, but they could be violently repressed. Well, that might happen, and definitely, you know, there are casualties in civilian defense. There's certainly low casualties when it comes to deaths, but there are in fact people arrested, injured, beaten up, and so on. But the point is that this sort of violent reaction to unarmed defenders has a very strong effect on bystanders, on those who see it on television, on social media. It arouses the support of those Canadians who have up to now been passive, who then join in fury against the beating up of people who are unarmed and simply trying to live peacefully in their own country, and is likely also to lead to a much broader disgust within the United States and response there in protest and so on against the government action. So those are three aspects of the nonviolent resistance. A fourth element is as Jamila very rightly emphasized throughout, is the importance of training and organization. I mean, a great deal was actually achieved in Czechoslovakia in a spontaneous way. People spontaneously defended their country from the 500,000 troops that invaded and did a very successful job. And at least for the first 7 days, but in fact, for the first 8 months, there was a hold off of a full implementation of a Soviet agenda. So training is important for three basic reasons. First of all, it's important that there be large numbers of people participating in civilian defense, and that you're able to demonstrate unity of purpose. So organization and training beforehand will ensure that there will be a good turnout for people within civilian defense. And by the way, simply setting up civilian defense facilities in Canada is itself a way of actually deterring any invasion, because of the obvious determination and unity that this kind of organization presents. The second reason why it's so important to have training beforehand is, as Jamila also pointed out, the vast number of nonviolent techniques that need to be learned, and the importance of also of moving from one set of tactics to another, of making the transition. So to begin with a complete non-cooperation, but at some point when the circumstances are correct, a more aggressive interventionist path needs to be taken. So there needs to be leaders who can make that transition and are able to telegraph that to people who understand what's going on in that context, and can then transition to the more assertive protest marches, sit-in strikes, blocking of airports and bridges, and all these sort of ways of refusing to go along with the occupying force. The third reason why training is crucial is discipline. Discipline is absolutely essential to effective nonviolent resistance. This was true with Gandhi and the Salt March and how that was organized. It's true with all the way through the importance of maintaining a nonviolent approach even in the context of violent repression. It's extremely hard to have that kind of discipline, but it's the power of nonviolence. It's found in the very persistence in nonviolence, that you do not pose a physical harm to the offended groups. You simply wish to live in your country. That leads to the complete demoralization of the occupying forces and the growth of more and more support for the civilian defenders. Well, the final question to ask, and I'll do that very quickly, is how can we establish civilian defense in Canada? Well, that breaks down into two questions. The first one is, what is to be established? And several analysts recently have talked about the importance of a civil defense corps being developed in Canada. Actually, civil defense developed in Canada in 1947 and was very active during the Cold War, but it's sort of fallen from view since the end of the Cold War and needs to be refurbished. And along with the civil defense originally was mainly to warn people of how to deal with nuclear attacks, of what supplies to bring in, of what their obligations were under those circumstances. The kind of civil defense corps I'm thinking of would also include training throughout the country in nonviolent civil defense, so that there would be a volunteer organization. In Sweden, 3.5% of the population has volunteered for civil defense. Perhaps in Canada, we could get at least 3% of the population of all ages, both sexes, to be volunteers. As well, there might be expanding the existing youth program. There's now a youth program especially oriented towards conservation, and that might become a one-year community service in which not only natural emergencies, but also human-made emergencies in the form of invasions would be part of the curriculum and training for the youth. There might also be a course in high school on civil defense, which would include not only obviously civilian defense, but also how to handle emergencies, natural emergencies. Because of our unwillingness to confront climate change, we can be sure that there will be more and more frequent extreme storm situation to deal with in Canada. So the training should also be to do with that kind of emergency training as well. Now, if we were to set up such a civil defense corps, and perhaps also a youth community service, how would that be done? And here we have an optimal and less optimal approaches. The optimal approach is that there would be a all-party resolution in the House of Commons establishing a civil defense corps with civil defense facilities throughout the country for training and informational purposes. And then in this case, the civilian defense would clearly be apolitical, nonpartisan, aimed only at defending the country from invasion. It would help also to build Canadian unity, and that's another advantage of it, but it would be nonpartisan. Unfortunately, owing to the political polarization we have in Canada as in other countries, owing to the amount of disinformation and conspiracy theories that are rife in social media, it is unlikely that we would gain support for an all-party agreement on civil defense corps. So perhaps a suboptimal alternative would be that 2 or 3 parties would be the sponsors of such a program, and at least then it would have a very wide, but not total, political support. If it's impossible to get official support for the civilian defense force, the only remaining possibility is social movements within civil society. already a number of peace organizations do provide training in nonviolence and generally on war and nonviolence. World Beyond War, for example, has a very good course they offer every year, and other organizations offer similar kinds of courses. So this could be expanded to get a good number of Canadians who are actually au courant with the with non-violent defense and the idea of transitioning from one kind of tactic to another as circumstances demand. This, however, is the least optimal of the options. Would probably be almost undoubtedly be characterized by the far right as a deep state attempt to squelch liberties or something of that nature, and it would therefore not be apolitical, which is the very best circumstance for a civilian defense force. In any event, what I'm suggesting is that non-violent civilian defense is ideally suited to Canada's circumstances. As a small country on the periphery of a superpower, we cannot hope to sustain ourselves through military confrontation. It would lead to enormous damage and to many casualties. So we need to rely on our people and nonviolent defense. There are many obstacles to setting this up, but many of them can be surmounted. And the main thing is to get started. Thank you.